Paratmanamekam jagadbijamadyam niriham nirakaram onkaravedyam yato jayate palyate yena vishvam tamisham bhaje liyate yatra vishvam. Hari Om Tatsat. Hari Om Tatsat. Hari Om Tatsat. Dear devotees, my namaskars to all of you. Ramakrishna Mission Ashrama Belagavi is commemorating Swami Vivekananda's visit to Belagavi in 1892, when Swamiji had stayed in Belagavi for 12 days, from 16th October to 28th October. So to celebrate this great event of Swamiji's visit to Belagavi, the Ramakrishna Mission Ashrama Belagavi is holding this online program, and I am honored that I have been invited to be a part of this very important online program to remember Swami Vivekananda's visit to Belagavi. I thank Revered Swami Atma Pranayama ji Maharaj and my pranams to him. And I have been requested today to share with you all my views on the subject of Raja Yoga, Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga. So at the very outset, I would wish to make one point very clear, that this session is going to be only an introduction to the subject of Raja Yoga, without going into the details. Those who wish to go into the details and take it as a serious practice, they have to approach an eligible teacher. Right in the beginning of Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, we find Swami Vivekananda making a very significant observation. Swami Vivekananda says, each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest this divinity by controlling nature, external and internal. Then Swamiji says, do this either by work or worship, psychic control or philosophy, by one or more or all of these, and be free. This is the whole of religion. So the real meaning of religion is the striving of the human soul for freedom, moksha, mukti. This moksha or mukti is attained by realizing one's own divine self or divine nature and manifesting it. And this manifestation of the divinity, this experience of the divinity, can be had either by work, that is karma yoga, or by worship, that is bhakti yoga, or by philosophy, that is jnana yoga, or it can be had by psychic control, that is Raja Yoga. So today our main concern is going to be attainment of this freedom through self-illumination in and through the path of psychic control, which is known as Raja Yoga. We have to answer three questions before we get into the subject. Who is the person who is eligible to practice Raja Yoga? Adhikari. Who is the Adhikari? Who is this candidate who can take up this practice of psychic control? What are his eligibility criteria or the basic requisites without which one cannot take up this practice? So he is a person who is eligible to take up this practice, who is endowed with a spirit of intense vairagya, dispassion for the things of the world, He has completely turned away from sensory pleasures, from physical pleasures, and from the tendency towards running towards the objects of enjoyments of the world. On the one side, he has got vairagya, and on the other side, he has got deep longing for the attainment of spiritual freedom. Added to these two virtues, he is a person who is introvert by nature. If a person has got these three basic qualities in himself, that person can take up the practice of psychic control and move towards the attainment of freedom through spiritual illumination. The second question is, what is the main subject matter of Raja Yoga? What is the methodology which is adopted here? As you have already got the hint, the methodology here, or the main subject matter here, is psychic control. Control of the human mind. More precisely, the antakarana. Even more precisely, the chitta. Now the third question is, what is that we are going to gain by controlling this mind stuff or controlling this chitta? What is the prayojana? What is the utility? What are we going to gain from this? So the goal of this discipline of psychic control, or control of the antakarana, or the control of the chitta, is attainment of freedom in and through self-knowledge or self-illumination. So once we have these three things clear, that is, who is the adhikari, and what is the main subject matter, and what is that we are going to gain, prayojana, adhikari, vishaya, and prayojana. Once we know this, then we can decide whether we are suitable for this pursuit or not, whether the subject matter is something which will be useful for us or not. This is the traditional method in which a spiritual discipline is presented to the students. In one of the Upanishads, it has been very beautifully stated that human mind itself is the cause of bondage, and the human mind itself is the cause of spiritual liberation. A mind which is steeped and drowned in sensory pleasures, in physical pleasures, a mind which is given to running after the objects of enjoyments of this world, such a mind, such a state of human consciousness becomes a cause of perpetual misery and suffering and bondage. Opposed to this is a mind which is detached from sensory pleasures and physical pleasures, and which has turned away from the objects of enjoyments of the world, and which is looking towards spiritual freedom. This kind of a mind, which is completely detached to the worldly things, becomes the cause of spiritual liberation. So that Upanishad, Amrita Bindu Upanishad, says, Mana eva karanam manushyanam bandha mokshayo. Mind itself is the karanam, cause of human bondage and human freedom or liberation. So from this statement, we can understand one thing, how important it is for us to understand the human mind itself. Here, the human mind itself is an object of inquiry of the human mind. In our day-to-day life, we hardly pay any attention to the nature of the functioning of the human mind. We are constantly busy with the things of the world outside. Mind is constantly being thrown out into the ocean of this world which we perceive through our sensory system. And we don't pay any attention to the nature of the human mind. So Raja Yoga is a subject in which human mind itself becomes the object of observation and inquiry of and investigating human mind. Mind is the observer and mind is the observed. Mind is the experimenter and mind is the object on which this experiment is being conducted. And it's a wonderful discipline in and through which we gain complete mastery over the human mind. So here comes the subject of understanding the human mind. In this regard, Swami Vivekananda gives a beautiful analogy. He compares the human mind to a monkey. A beautiful comparison, an apt comparison. How is the human mind similar to a monkey? A monkey is by its very nature restless. We all know that. To such a restless monkey which cannot sit quiet, even for a moment, it is constantly jumping from one place to the other. This is the nature of the human mind. Now this monkey, which is restless by its own nature, if it is made to drink wine, what will happen? Now this restless monkey which has been made to drink wine, if it is further stung by a scorpion, what will happen? Finally, this restless monkey, which is by its very nature restless, which has been made to drink wine, which has been stung by a scorpion, and now if a ghost enters into it and possesses it, what will be the state of this monkey? It is totally out of control. Swami Vivekananda says this is the nature of the so-called ordinary human mind, which is steeped or drowned in the things of the world. First of all, by the very nature, the mind is restless, like the monkey. And like the restless monkey, this mind which is restless, it is made to drink the wine of desires and passions. It becomes more restless. Then it is stung by the scorpion of lust and jealousy. It becomes even more turbulent. And finally, it is possessed by the ghost, by the demon of arrogance and pride. It becomes almost mad, out of control. Swami Vivekananda says that this is the so-called the state of human mind, which is drowned in the so-called the world which we are perceiving through our sensory system. It is totally out of control. It is a mind which is driving us. We are being driven by the mind from one corner to the other corner. And this is the story of the human life. Now the Raja Yogi reverses this. He doesn't want the mind to drive him. Now he wants to drive the mind by gaining complete mastery over the mind. This is the science of Raja Yoga. There is one more beautiful analogy which Swami Vivekananda presents to us to understand what we are going to accomplish by Raja Yoga. He says that mind is like a lake. This Antakarana is like a lake. Now on the lake, we see waves and ripples. And because of the waves and ripples on the surface of the lake, the bottom of the lake is not perceivable. It is not visible. The bottom of the lake will be visible and perceivable only when the lake becomes free from waves and ripples. When the waves subside, when there are no waves on the surface of the lake, then and then alone can we see the bottom of the lake. Now this is the analogy to understand what we are going to do in Raja Yoga. This Antakarana or the mind stuff or the Chitta is like a vast lake. And the bottom of this Antakarana, where resides the true self, our true self is at the bottom of this Antakarana. That true self, which is the bottom of the Antakarana, is not perceivable for us now because on the surface of this Antakarana, on the surface of this Chitta or the mind, there is constant rising and falling of waves and ripples. It is never freed from waves and ripples, and that is the reason we never understand who we are in our true nature. Now, the main concern of the Raja Yogi is to still the waves of the mind, to make the surface of the mind, to make the surface of the chitta waveless, rippleless. When he accomplishes this, what happens? He straight away perceives the bottom of his antakarana. He experiences his own true self. Now, this is what the great teacher of meditation, the Rishi Patanjali, he defines as yoga. The beautiful definition given by Rishi Patanjali of yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. What is yoga? Yoga means to completely restrain the mind in such a fashion that there are no vrittis on the surface of the mind. There are no vrittis, no waves, no ripples on the surface of the chitta. Chitta vritti nirodha. Vritti are the waves which constantly rise and fall on the surface of the chitta. It is going on eternally, right from our day we were born till we go to the cremation ground. This is the story of the human life. We are being driven by these waves rising on the surface of the chitta, and that is what actually controls the human being. Now, the Raja Yogi wants to control these vrittis. He wants to control the human mind. He wants to take the whole thing under his control. This is the science of self-mastery, by mastering the human mind itself. So, yoga, according to Patanjali, is chitta vritti nirodha. Not letting the mind stuff or chitta break into waves. Now, this is the target. The Raj Yogi aims at attaining this. This is the reason when I said that who is the adhikari or the person who is eligible to take up this practice seriously. That person has to have intense vairagya, and he has to have intense longing to experience the bottom of his antakarana, where lies his true self, and he has to be introvert by nature. A hyperactive person cannot take up this discipline. If a person has to take up this discipline, he has to have the tendency of always looking within his own mind. Such a person can take up the practice of Raja Yoga. Now, as Patanjali has defined, yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. Now, how is this chitta vritti nirodha attained or accomplished? How is this Raja Yogi going to make his mind stuff free from the rising and falling of the waves on the surface of the mind or the chitta? How is it going? How is he going to do that? So Patanjali has prescribed a method in which there are 8 steps or 8 parts. That is why it is known as Ashtanga. Ashtanga, 8 angas, 8 parts or 8 steps towards the attainment of this goal, where the mind stuff is completely restrained. So, what are these 8 steps? Number 1, Yama. Number 2, Niyama. Number 3, Asana. Number 4, Pranayama. Number 5, Pratyahara. Number 6, Dharana. Number 7, Dhyana. And number 8, Samadhi. In and through these 8 steps, taken up one after the other in a gradual sequence, this Raja Yogi finally succeeds in completely restraining his antakarana, restraining his mind stuff, restraining his chitta. And in this way, when the chitta is completely silenced and made free from all the rising and falling of the waves, what happens is this Raja Yogi straight away perceives the bottom of the antakarana, where lies our true self. So the next verse, the next sutra of this Patanjali Yoga Sutra says, Tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam. When this kind of a state of mind is brought about by a consistent practice over a long period of time, when this Raja Yogi succeeds in completely restraining the waves which usually fall and rise on the surface of the human mind, when he succeeds in doing that, what happens? Tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam. At that time, this self completely resides in its own self. This yogi then experiences his own true nature as completely separated from the antakarana. The Purusha is experienced to be separated from Prakriti. This is the goal of Raja Yoga, in which this Raja Yogi experiences his own self to be completely different from this antakarana, which is the Prakriti. And when this kind of an experience comes, he becomes freed from the bondage of this body and the mind. This is the whole of religion as defined by Swami Vivekananda. Religion is the human striving for mukti, for freedom from our slavery to the body and the mind. Now, we have spoken about this Ashtanga, the 8 steps towards the attainment of this kind of a state of mind. So, the first one is Yama. In Yama, we have 5 things to be practiced. What are these 5 things? They are Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, and Aparigraha. These are all universal, general practices meant for all spiritual aspirants. If one has to be a yogi, if one wants to attain spiritual freedom or liberation or moksha, one has to have a firm foundation in these practices, without which we cannot progress in spiritual life. One has to be freed from himsa. He has to practice ahimsa, not hurting anyone, not causing pain to anyone. One has to be truthful, satya. One cannot even imagine to be a yogi or a spiritual aspirant when one speaks falsity, when he takes refuge in falsity. One has to be truthful in his behavior, in his thought, in his deeds, in his actions. He has to be truthful. Then one has to practice non-stealing, asteya. Then it is very important for oneself to practice continence, brahmacharya, that is complete control over our sexual energy, not letting it indulge in sexual pleasures. This continence is the very backbone of this success in the practice of Raja Yoga. And finally comes the practice of aparigraha, not to hoard anything in our life. Now the next point comes is niyama. Niyama also is a set of 5 virtues which we have to practice, in which the first one is shaucha, second is santosha, third is tapa, fourth is swadhyaya, and the fifth is ishvara pranidhana. Shaucha means cleanliness. One has to be clean. You can't expect to be a yogi when you are dirty in your body and mind. Cleanliness doesn't only mean the physical cleanliness, it also implies the cleanliness of the whole of the mind. Practicing purity is very important, vital for every spiritual aspirant. So shaucha, then santosha, practice of contentment. A person cannot be expected to be a yogi who is discontented with himself. One has to have some amount of contentment. Then only he can focus his mind on the target. Third is tapas. Tapas is austerity. Austerity means controlling of one's sensory system and the mind and focusing it on the goal. This is what is known as austerity. Then comes Swadhyaya. Swadhyaya means taking up the study of those works which will help us move in the direction of self-knowledge and self-illumination. And finally comes Ishvara Pranidhana, taking refuge at the feet of Ishvara or Bhagavan. So these 5 virtues or practices have to be taken up seriously. And these two together, Yama and Niyama, they are the very base on which the structure of yoga stands. Without a strong base of Yama and Niyama, no one can even dream of becoming a yogi. So the first step in the attainment of Chitta Vritti Nirodha is a firm foundation to be laid in and through the practice of Yama and Niyama. Once we have these things firmly in our personality and character, then comes the next step, which is asana. Asana means posture. Now see, this is a science of psychic control in which meditation is a very important part of it. And when you talk about meditation, we have to train our body to be stationed in a certain posture which is comfortable as well as steady. Patanjali defines asana as sthira sukham asanam. Asanam is that which is sthira and as well as sukham. It should be steady as well as it should be comfortable. You hold your body in such a way that your body is firm as well as it is very comfortable, it is relaxed, there is no tension in it. You hold your back straight. The hip, the shoulders, the neck and the head has to be held in a straight line. This is very important as far as asana is concerned. Once we have perfected this asana, the next comes the practice of pranayama, a very important part of Ashtanga Yoga, and which has to be done very carefully and under the proper guidance of a true teacher. Usually we think that our breath is prana. This is a big misconception which we need to correct. That is, the breath is not prana. Breath is the expression of prana. By regulating the breath, we get hold of prana. So prana is something much deeper. Prana is that which causes breathing on us. We are breathing because of the functioning of the prana. So if we have to get hold of that prana, we have to learn to regulate our breath in a very systematic fashion. This regulation of the breath is what is known as pranayama, in and through which you gain control and mastery over the prana. Patanjali says, Shvasa prashvasayor gati vichhedaha. Pranayama is gati vichhedaha, stopping or regulating the shvasa and prashvasa in a very systematic manner. Shvasa is inhalation, prashvasa is exhalation. By regulating this inhalation and exhalation of breath, slowly and in a very systematic manner, we begin to gain control over the prana. Now, when we gain control over the prana, we also begin to gain control over the mind. This is the whole connection. That is why in this science of psychic control, pranayama plays a very important role. But it should be done very carefully and under the proper guidance of a teacher. After pranayama comes the real mental exercises, and they are 4 in number. Till now, these first 4 points, yama, niyama, asana and pranayama, this is more physical in nature. And the remaining 4, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana and samadhi, they are completely psychic and spiritual. So, what is pratyahara? Pratyahara is the discipline by which we make the sense organs turn away from the sense objects and make it merge with the mind stuff itself. In short, pratyahara means complete mastery over the sensory system and making it one with the mind stuff itself, not letting it get connected with sense objects. Presently, our sense organs are constantly getting connected with sense objects. So, that discipline of the mind by which we hold the sense organs, stop it from going towards the sense objects, and turn its direction towards the mind stuff itself. This is known as pratyahara. Now, once we gain success in this practice, then comes the next very important practice, the stepping stone towards meditation, and that is dharana. Dharana means now fixing this mind on one object or at one point. Now, when we succeed in fixing the mind on one object or at one point, that becomes dharana. And when this dharana gets prolonged, as the mind sticks to that one object over a period of time, that very dharana progresses into dhyana, where the mind is now constantly and in an unbroken fashion moving towards that object and that object alone, to the exclusion of all other objects. This is what is known as dhyana. Pratyaya ekatana dhyana. There is pratyaya ekatanata. There is constantly only one pratyaya. That is only there is one modification of the mind which is completely of that one object on which we have focused the mind. Now finally, when this dhyana is prolonged over a period of time, it matures into samadhi, where all the waves of the mind are completely restrained, and this antakarana, the mind stuff, becomes waveless, freed from ripples and waves. Now, this is the goal. Once this state is attained, where the mind stuff has become completely freed from the waves and ripples, what happens? As it was mentioned earlier, tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam. At that time, in and through this kind of a controlled psyche, in and through this kind of a controlled human mind, that Raja Yogi experiences his own true self, completely separated from the antakarana. The Purusha is experienced to be completely separated from Prakriti, and he experiences spiritual liberation and freedom. So in this way, according to Patanjali, in and through the practice of these 8 steps, one after the other, the Raja Yogi succeeds in accomplishing Chitta Vritti Nirodha, and in and through this Chitta Vritti Nirodha, he experiences one's own true self. Tada drashtu surupe avasthanam. In this way, this Raja Yoga is that science by which we gain complete mastery over the antakarana or the chitta, in and through which the divinity is realized and experienced, and in and through this experience of divinity, one attains spiritual freedom and mukti. Now, a few words of caution here. This practice of pranayama should be taken up under the guidance of an eligible teacher. It should not be done just by reading books. That will be dangerous for the practitioner. So we need to be very careful about this one point, that pranayama, the very sophisticated and very more complicated practices of pranayama, should be taken up only under the guidance of a proper teacher. It should not be done on by one's own self. Secondly, the practice of Brahmacharya is very vital in the practice of pranayama. If one is not perfected in this brahmacharya, this practice of pranayama can become dangerous. Another one point which comes to my mind is in this regard, that is, Sri Shankaracharya says very beautifully in Viveka Chudamani that yogasya prathamam dwaram vam nirodha. The first doorway to yoga is control of human speech. A talkative person can never be a yogi. Yogi is a person of a man of few words. He is a person of a few words. Unless we have control over our speech, we won't be able to have a mastery or a control over the mind, because the speech and the mind are the two sides of the same coin. So the first doorway towards yoga is vam nirodha, control of the speech. Secondly, a person who eats too much cannot be yogi, and a person who eats too less, he also cannot be a yogi. A person who sleeps too much cannot be a yogi, and a person who is hyperactive also cannot be yogi in this sense. In this way, for a person to be a yogi, he has to lead a very balanced life. It is the path of Madhya Panta, as Sri Krishna said in the Bhagavad Gita. Yukta ahara viharasya yukta cheshtasya karmasu yukta swapnavabodhasya yogo bhavati dukkha. There has to be a perfect balance between work and rest, between eating and fasting. We should not go to the extreme. The yogi adopts the middle path. In and through such a very controlled and a very moderate kind of a lifestyle at the physical plane, with a mind completely given to the attainment of spiritual freedom, in and through psychic control, by adopting these 8 steps, one after the other, in a dedicated fashion, over a period of time, this yogi succeeds in gaining complete mastery over the mind stuff. He succeeds in putting an end to the rising and falling of the waves on the mind stuff. And in and through that, he succeeds in experiencing the bottom of his own antakarana. Tada drashtu swarupi avasthanam. He experiences his own true self, completely distinct from the mind stuff. And that takes him to the doors of liberation and mukti. So this is the science of Raja Yoga in a very brief, and we have given here in a bird's eye view, but it is not as simple as it has been stated here. Each and every step can be studied in a very detailed manner. There are many things to be known in this, but in an overall fashion, this is what the science of Raja Yoga essentially deals with. As Swami Vivekananda has stated, this is that science in which the yogi takes up his own mind and gains control over it. And by gaining complete control and mastery over his own mind, he realizes his own true selves and he attains freedom. Thank you so much.